fails. So I think
it's okay. You're okay. You're okay. I just have to, I'm going to take you off the screen for just a second. I have to go live. Otherwise, before the time runs out, otherwise we can't go live. So I'm sorry for that. So for those of you joining, hi, I'm McKenna from Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. And I am equal parts sad and happy tonight to be joined by Jacqueline Winspear. Sad because we always get Jackie in the store launch week, and it's always such a pleasure to see her. She is one of my all-time favorite authors. We have a close personal connection with her at the store. And so to settle for a virtual event, I guess we'll settle, but I wish she was here in person. And sorry again, Jackie, for going live mid-sentence, but it would have not let me go live otherwise. So as people are joining the event, I just want to mention a couple things. Tomorrow night, we'll be back with Alma Katsu for her new book, Red Widow, and she's going to be interviewed by Allison Leota. Unfortunately, our Crime Fiction Legends box, if you're a subscriber to that, it's been delayed just a little bit. One of the selections got lost in the mail, and we are bending heaven and earth to try to figure out where they are and get them to us. But we're hoping to get them out by the end of the week, so please be patient. It's a March selection, and it's still March, so they should get out by the end of the month. Before I bring on Jackie, I do want to mention that we have signed copies of this, the 16th, I think, Maisie Dobbs book. We have copies that were shipped to her and that she signed, as well as tipped in copies from the publisher. So we'd love if you're considering ordering a copy from us. We also have a pretty cool event coming up in April, something we haven't done before that is, count it down to the pandemic, but we're actually going to be hosting all 6 authors who are nominated for the Edgar Award for Best Novel in cooperation with the MWA. We'll be doing that April 24th at 1 o'clock. We've got people joining us from overseas. That's why it's a midday event. But that should be pretty cool. I'm excited about it. And maybe it'll be a tradition going forward now that we've worked out how to do all these virtual things. The Edgar Awards will be virtual again this year. And so we're looking forward to having those authors join us. Okay, now it is time to bring on our star of the evening. Hi, Jackie.
Hello. It's lovely to see you. And I must agree, it's just so hard not to be with you guys this year. It really is.
I know. I'm missing my hug.
Yeah, me too. And how's that wonderful dog, Maisie Dobbs?
She's great. If I thought I could actually not destroy this recording studio situation, I would angle the computer down. She is sleeping in a bed right next to me. But as the adage goes, let sleeping dogs lie. So
absolutely,
we're just gonna leave her there. My husband is not here this evening, and normally he's the dog wrangler. And so if she's quiet, I'm just gonna let her be quiet.
Absolutely.
So many of you watching, of course, know Jacqueline Winspear already, but I'm going to go ahead and do our official formal introduction as we do every night. So Jacqueline Winspear is the author of the New York Times bestselling Maisie Dobbs series, of which her new book, The Consequences of Fear, is the 16th installment. Her standalone novel, The Care and Management of Lies, was also a New York Times bestseller and a Dayton Literary Peace Prize finalist. Originally from the United Kingdom, she now lives in California. And my bio fails to mention the wonderful memoir that came out a few months ago that we also spoke with you about. So we'll get to that. Right. We'll get to that in a little bit. So how are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much. Actually, I don't know if I'll be fine on Sunday because I'm having my second COVID jab on my second shot on Saturday. So I was telling one of my cousins about that the other day, and she said, oh, well, then Sunday should be a duvet day. And I thought, I've not heard that before. I think that's wonderful, having a duvet day, when you just wrap yourself up in your duvet. So
I will say that through a friend of a friend of a friend, I was fortunate enough to get both like a month ago. Got the second one maybe, about a month ago. And I got mine on a Saturday, and Sunday was absolutely a duvet day. So have some tea ready and your duvet and just take it easy. It's a little bit of a rough go for 24 hours, but well worth it. And I'm excited for you. That's great.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to just having it done, getting it over and done with. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so lots of things happening in this book. Why don't you tell us about Consequences of Fear?
Oh gosh, I mean, if I could do these sort of explanations very quickly, I wouldn't write, so all those pages. The book centers around several things, but let's just say chiefly a young lad called Freddie Hackett. Freddie is a message runner during the war. This is October 1941. He's 12 years old and he's running messages because he's a very fast sprinter. So he's been sort of plucked out and chosen as one of those boys to run messages. In his case, it's actually, although he doesn't know this, but they're actually Secret Service offices that he runs between. And so he's familiar with someone like Robert McFarlane. He knows Mr. McFarlane. But anyway, he's running a message one night and he sees something horrible. He sees someone's life taken. And it's very, very scary because life is very scary for Freddie Hackett in any case. Not only is he running messages after school, during bombings and seeing just horrible things, but he has a very difficult home life. He reports what he's seen to the police, but of course they don't believe him. They think he's a boy who's just seen too much. And also the police are really swamped. I mean, one of the things that was a bit covered up a bit in during the war was actually there was an awful lot of crime. There was a black market, there was looting, and so on and so forth. And also the police were very short-staffed because of men being called up to join the services. So they didn't have time to listen to Freddie Hackett. And yet he was having nightmares. He was distraught. And so he decided to go to the office of a woman to whom he had delivered a message before. And he knew, because of the plaque, what she did. And Maisie first hears of this from Billy Beale. She's at her home in Kent. And Billy calls her just to check in, say, when you're coming in tomorrow morning, because she goes in on a Monday. And because he wants to make sure that she sees this boy. And then let's just say it begins to cross paths with her other work.
Right, exactly. Well, I think it's wonderful. And I will say it was nice to, revisit with some of the characters in other books too, to see how things are going. So we're in, is it 1941 in this book?
Yes. So, October 1941.
So things are certainly ramping up even more so. But I want to just talk to you about where the love of this time period came from, because you represent the world so well that we feel like we're living it with Maisie Dobbs. And obviously you haven't lived in that time period. So I know it's from family stories, but how do you feel like this period so well?
Gosh, that's a really good question. And I think there are several sort of prongs to that. And number one, yes, family stories. I was sort of born and raised in quite a rural area, and because my parents had left London several years after the war. So that period was very vivid in their minds, obviously. And I think because of the distance them from their families, the stories that I heard were about the war chiefly and were about that time period. And so, there was this real childhood curiosity when I spent time with my grandparents. And also my parents, as I say, we lived in a rural area, and on the street where we lived, I mean, it was mainly, with the exception of one other couple, elderly people. And my parents were known as that young couple, and I think they were still known as that young couple 25 years later when they moved, But it only had to, one of those elderly ladies only had to say to me, "Oh, well, in my day," or something like that. And I would be right there. I would be really curious about, well, yes, what happened in your day? And not only that, there were several women in the area who were women of that generation from World War I who were miss. There was no husband and children, and the sweetheart they might have married had perished in the war. And one of the tragedies of that generation is that for so many of them, they didn't have children. And so many of them became teachers, and also just became like sort of the great aunt that was always fun to be with. And I would very often be invited round to tea by one of these ladies, and for each one of them there was that sepia photograph on the mantelpiece and a story to be told. And I mean, I was one of those, I soaked up other people's stories. But still, I found that there was this fascination with the period. And as I got into my teens, I mean, I think my mother thought that you know, she just has got this thing about vintage clothing, you know, because I used to go out looking as though I came from the wrong era. And also vintage clothing was cheap, you know. But I was always after vintage clothing. And then even much later, I had a friend, I got really into Art Deco, and my friend had a stall down Portobello Road in London, and we dealt in Art Deco china and pottery. So the whole era came alive for me in so many ways. And I've realized that what I'm interested in is that period just before the Great War. So we're talking about sort of 1910 onwards, and then right up to the end right up to the end of rationing in Britain after the Second World War, which actually didn't truly end until the end of 1954, but there were shortages going into 55 and 56. And I realized that what it was this fascination with this extraordinary time when so much changed in society, and for me, being interested in women's history, particularly in the lives of women, and it fascinated me. But all aspects of it fascinated me, you know, right down to, you know, the clothing people wore and how they dressed and why they dressed in that way. What, you know, the rise and fall of hemlines, and the fact that women, you know, came out of corsets really suddenly, you know, because let's face it, there you are say you're in about 1913 or something, and you expect your life to be like your mothers and your grandmothers before you, and you've got all this corsetry on as soon as you get to a certain age, and then suddenly you can't wear corsets if you're working in a musician's factory or driving a bus, working down a coal mine, or being a nurse on the front lines, an ambulance driver. You've got to be able to move. And women started to be able to move, and you look at that in a very emotional, spiritual way as well. It fascinates me.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes across in your books too, because you know, whether it's the period detail of what they're wearing or just the changes in everyday life, it does draw the full picture. You know, the interesting thing too, of course, is when the men came home and when the women were in those jobs, like, how do you go back to before also? You know, my husband and I were in the car yesterday, and we were listening to a British pub quiz, and one of the questions was about rationing, and I was so surprised. It was, what year was sugar rationing over? What ended in 1956 or something? And it was sugar rationing, and I could not believe it was so long after the war. It's incredible. Before I move on to the next question, I was so excited about talking to you. I failed to mention, if you have questions, please put them in the comments. If you're watching, thank you for joining us this evening. I've already got some questions here from YouTube, but if you're on Facebook, you can put those in the comments. On YouTube, we'll put them in the live chat, and I'll get to them in just a little bit. Okay, so Maisie has an interesting approach to investigation. It's psychological and kind. Where did that idea come from? I mean, she's not a gumshoe, you know. She definitely has a unique approach that I love. I love reading.
It came sort of organically. I can't say any more than that. I didn't plan to have her be like that, because I actually didn't plan to write the first book in the series. The first book in the series, the story found me. I mean, it was one of those things that, you know, I've called it, and people have probably heard me say this before, my moment of artistic grace, you know, when you're sitting there in traffic minding your own business, and suddenly you have this image in front of you, and it's a whole scene plays out, and you think, ooh. And I've heard of that happening to other writers. Oh, you know, J.K. Rowling, she got 6 Harry Potters on a train. So, you know, I got a Maisie Dobbs stuck in traffic. And it's not that I decided this is how she will be. It's as if as I developed the character and as she revealed herself to me, this is who I knew her to be. That she had a different way of looking at the world, and that she has a kindness and a respect. And I think there are various reasons for that in her background. And I think she probably, she has her own times when she's had a lack of confidence. So she does tiptoe very gradually around things, but she also has a real sense, and she got this from Dr. Maurice Blanche, her mentor, that, that thin line between sort of the victim and the perpetrator of a crime. And frankly, I know where I got that sense from. And it's really funny because I know this, but people are going to think, well, she was a bit slow on the uptake there. But I never put two and two together until I wrote my memoir, that my mother's job had quite an impact on me. My mother's career job. My mom had lots of jobs, but then she had her big career job, where she worked for the Home Office in prisons administration. And she started off working in a boys' detention center, which is for young offenders between 16 and 21, as it was called when she was doing this, a detention center. And they were not first-time offenders. And then she moved on to different types of prison, not in a disciplinary role. It was always in administration, but she had a lot of contact with prisoners. And then she moved higher up, so to speak. But she used to sometimes talk about her work, because I think she just had this, especially when she had a story to tell that was perhaps very sad, about someone who had got into the bad crowd or whatever. And I can remember her coming home one day, looking a bit down, and I made her a cup of tea. And I actually said to her, what do you think makes people do these things? What makes, and she said, because someone somewhere along the way didn't care enough. And that could have been before birth or whatever, but someone, it could have been in a previous generation. Someone didn't care enough. And, I just, that stayed with me. And I think what that has come to with Maisie Dobbs is that she cares enough. She cares enough about everybody. She's not afraid of doing the tough thing when someone has to be brought to book, when she has to reveal, who has committed a crime, but it's who was not kind enough. And I think that's something that came out from the beginning, who did not care enough.
Well, and she doesn't see her world in, her world is never in black and white terms. Maisie, I feel like Maisie lives in shades of gray, because understanding no one is all bad, all good. There's a reason that something has happened. And I think we can use more of that in the world in general.
Well, as a writer, I all the interesting things are in gray. Well, look at me with my gray shirt. But the black and white, that's black and white. But you want to get down to the really interesting exploration of character. I go straight to the gray areas. Mm-hmm. That's, to me, where it gets really juicy for every single character, to the extent that I will explore them in any book. Some characters come to the fore, some drop into the background. Those gray areas, 50 Shades of Gray, that's it.
So over the years, because I've heard this story about, Maisie coming to you fully formed, over the years, has her character changed in ways that surprised you?
I think sometimes I have had my surprises about her. I've often more had surprises about the story I'm writing. Mm-hmm. I think it was, I'm trying to remember which one it was now in particular. And I think I think it was Messenger of Truth. I'm not sure. But it was A Lesson in Secrets. I got to right near the end and realized the person I thought had done it did not do it. It was someone else that had done it. I was like, oh my gosh, I was there all the time and I didn't see it. Which is a great way to be as a writer when you're shocked by your own book. Oh boy, it was him. I didn't know. He pulled a fast one there. But with Maisie, it's, and as I said, as I create the character and as she reveals herself to me, one of the, I think, rewarding things as a writer is to be able to have a true arc to the character over a series, so that you're revealing a character in a body of work. That is very, it's a very interesting process. And if ever anybody asks, what's the difference between writing, say, a standalone novel, which I've done, and a series, it was a different experience having to explore the characters in just one book, which has always been why I'd like to do another book, just to do that again. But to have it over a series, it's actually, I think in a way it's almost more natural, because let's face it, if you and I meet at a party or whatever, and we get chatting with it, that's a nice person, I'd like to get to know her, so we meet for coffee, and then another time we go for a walk, and then we have dinner together. You don't tell someone everything about you the second you know them, do you? You reveal yourselves over time, and therefore you have a bond. And I think that's what's happened with Maisie Dobbs. So in a way, she's not shocked me yet, although she did shock me a bit, I suppose, with this one. Yeah, she did shock me towards the end. Just a bit.
Well, don't worry, we won't have spoilers. Don't worry.
No.
So, okay, we have grown with Maisie and we love her. You have put her through some things, like, it's been hard as readers. When you are writing something like that, a tough time for Maisie, is it hard for you?
Yes. Yes. Or I think there were 2 times when it was really tough, and I'm trying not to give away too much in case some readers haven't got along too far, but in Pardonable Lies, when she returns to France, and she goes to the very place where she saw death of a most terrible kind as a young woman. She was 17 years of age. She had lied about her age to serve as a nurse, and she goes to the place where not only had she seen death of a most terrible kind, but she was herself wounded. And 2 things there. I actually was planning, and I'm looking back, and I think it was in the midst of writing that book. Yes, I was in the midst of writing it, but in the early stages, I knew what was going to happen. And I actually visited the battlefields of the Somme and Ypres. That was my second visit. And I went, actually, and I didn't even know these things existed yet. I'd already written it into a novel. There were different types of battlefield cemeteries. And I went to a very small battlefield cemetery that was specifically a casualty clearing station cemetery. It was exactly where there had been a casualty clearing station. All the graves there were people that had died there, including several doctors and nurses were buried there. And literally I had to walk between 2 houses to get there. The rain was slanting, just like the soldiers described it in the Great War. Yeah. It was coming down like stair rods. And I can remember standing there looking at the graves and thinking, how would I feel if? And that's the big question I find myself asking all the time as a writer, and I'm sure other writers would just say they do exactly the same. I was standing there thinking, how would I feel if I was coming back to the place where I had lost my innocence in the way that you do when you see death at an early age? And I thought, what would happen to me? And I knew I would fall to my knees and I would break down. And I almost did. So when I wrote that scene, I mean, literally, I wrote the scene and stopped, and I had to go out and remind myself that I live in California, and it's, it's not that century at all, and I live a different kind of life. And the other one was there was a time when in the mapping of love and death, and when I don't want to give a game away, but someone dies who's very important to the series. And I actually wrote the scene, and I was in tears. And I phoned my literary agent. I said, "Oh, you'll never guess what." She went, "What's happened? What's happened?" And I told her. She went, "Oh no!" We started both bawling our eyes out.
Yeah.
But also scenes of war, writing scenes of war. You have to be, you're working with very, very heavy material. You're working with very heavy fabric, and you have to be very careful with that. You have to give, you have to weave in such a way that your reader is with you and feels what you can feel and feels what people would have felt, but then you have to move on,
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it makes sense. Of course it makes sense.
Yeah.
And you have to have a respect for those experiences of the war, right? So,
Yes.
But to balance that, that kind of is what makes the moments of joy in Maisie's life even better as a reader. And I think that as a reader of the series, we feel the same way when we're reading, because you've worked so hard to have a genuine emotional response to that time period and what your character's going through. We feel like we know her and the characters like family. Do you, as you're writing, just have everyone in your head, or do you have a Bible with all their information and descriptives and who's related to whom?
I wish I was that organized, really. No, I don't have any Bible that I go to. I just sort of know, and I go back. And sometimes I have to check on something, but usually I just know who they are. And actually, that brings it. I come to them fresh every time. I mean, actually, I wish they weren't in my head so much. I mean, someone like Maurice Blanche, he can really get into your head, and you have to go away. I'm not writing about you right now. Go away, leave me alone. But yes, it's and also going back one step, with Maisie and her character and so on. That's why the other characters are so important. So there are moments of lightness. There are moments of humor. I mean, Priscilla, for example, is actually a very serious person, but she's also one of the. What I'd do, Maisie, if I were you, and she's that sort of person that roll of the eyes, here she goes again, if you don't get out of that black dress, I'm going to rip it up, because I want you. She's that sort of character. And other characters, Maisie's father, very grounded, and he's an anchor for her. And so we look for those anchors in stories so that when she's floating off, he can anchor her,
Yeah, absolutely. So there is an American love interest in this book. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
The American love interest is Mark Scott, who we first met in Journey to Munich. And he and Maisie had an odd relationship in that, they sort of really liked each other, but they were at odds because they were sort of seemingly quite different. But he does save her life, and then sort of he turns up again, and then really turns up again because he's now associated with the American embassy in London during the war. And interestingly enough, he had in a previous book, he had a very interesting job in that when we first met him, we worked with the Justice Department, Bureau of Investigation, that was a forerunner of the FBI. And I had him as someone who was, let's say, keeping an eye on the then ambassador to London, Joseph Kennedy. And it was quite a divisive character, actually. And what was strange was that after I'd written it and I'd made up, I'd given him a job, okay, so this is what he's doing, I actually found out that there really was someone at the embassy in exactly that job who was reporting directly to the president, and their name is not known in. I remember I was researching something else and came across and thought, oh my gosh, he really was there. But Mark Scott, I think I've got a bit of a crush on Mark Scott, to tell you the truth. he's got a bit of the gift of the gab, and he's another character. He takes Maisie out of herself, and she knows that, and yet he respects who she is, and she has a great deal of regard for him. Let's say that, a great deal of regard for him.
Wonderful. Well, it's a treat. I think the way that you phrased it, that he kind of gets her out of her own head. He gets her in a different place is nice. And that's like you were saying, that's what all these characters do. Even Billy, you know, the helpful sidekick, for lack of a better word. They all round her out as a lovely supporting cast. So, okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about reading. We do have questions. Don't be shy. Like I said, a couple of reminders. We have signed copies if you're interested in ordering. And also, there's no such thing as a dumb question. Try to avoid spoilers. There's one in here that I may or may not mention. We'll see. But you can pop questions in here and we'll get to them in a little bit. So, rewind. Obviously, young Jacqueline Winspear was surrounded with ladies telling stories of the war and in love with vintage clothes. But I want to hear about your love of reading. What did you read in your formative years, and what made you think, I want to be a writer?
Well, I read anything that was going in my formative years. You know, my parents couldn't leave anything around. I loved reading newspapers as a kid. Really loved it. My dad always liked to be the first one to get his hands on the newspaper because, of course, it'd get wrecked otherwise. And so I always managed to get there first. But I had my first library card when I was about 2, 3 or something like that. We had when I was a kid, our town had a very small library. It was, it couldn't have been more than 15 feet by 15 feet, something like that. And the children's section was sort of right over there by the wall. And I loved it because it was a major stop on our way into town every week. My mum had to push my brother in the pram for 2 miles to get down to the town. And she did the library run for the elderly people in the street. So there was a mound of books in the pram, and my poor little baby brother was squashed up one end. And so she'd be picking those out, and I was allowed to pick out 2 library books. And it was whatever took my fancy. But you know what? I always tried to find the ones that no one had read before me, because I liked a new book. So that was my, that was the general rule of thumb. I'd go through the books and see what, but of course, obviously one grows up and I still like a brand new book though. But we had a lot of, my dad, because of his job, he worked in sort of the building trade. He was sometimes working in old houses where they were getting rid of books, and he'd just bring home a pile of books. And so, you never knew what you might find. I used to because of that, I used to end up reading a lot of really old children's books. It's quite, because maybe it's the house of an old lady and from Victorian times. So I didn't care. I just, words on a page, I'd read it. But I made my declaration about wanting to be a writer when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And I already loved writing. I loved writing little stories. But I used to have to go to the hospital every couple of weeks because I had quite severe lazy eyes, which haven't improved as I've got older, I must admit. But you had to go to the hospital then to have these exercises before they would operate on you, which they did eventually. It was a long journey on a bus. So the bus stopped outside this one house on the way home, literally every visit. And I could see into it because we always sat at the top of the bus, double-decker bus. Otherwise, I would not have been able to see into it because it was surrounded by this big hedge. And you could look straight down, double-fronted Edwardian villa. And in the bay, on one side, the bay window, there was a desk. On the desk was a typewriter. And there was invariably, there was paper in the typewriter. There was a pile of books next to the typewriter, maybe some paper, a cup and saucer, sometimes a cardigan thrown over the back of the chair. And you looked into the room and literally it was all books. It was like looking into your office there, except it was a big Edwardian room with lots of bookshelves. And then at the far end, there was always a fire alight in the grate. And I just used to look at this room because I wanted it because of all those books, And I can remember my one day I called my mum. She was sitting at the front with my brother, who was pretending to be the driver, and I said, "Who do you think lives there? Quick, 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 quick! We're going to move. Who lives there?" And my mum peered over and looked out the window and said, "Oh, well, that's a writer's. I would imagine a writer lives there." I said, "That's what I'm going to be when I grow up. I'm going to be a writer." And she didn't miss a beat. "Well, my dear, well, if you're going to be a writer, then you're going to have another string to your bow, because you can't be a starving writer in a garret." And the funny thing is that as young as I was, I started collecting all these bits and pieces. You know, the man up the road gave me a desk for my bedroom. One of the old ladies gave me this ancient Anglepoise lamp, which actually electrocuted me the first time I plugged it in. And my mother, who was a smoker in those days, and this was when you get coupons in your cigarette packets, she saved up her coupons to buy me the petite typewriter, which was blue and pink, and she taught me to touch type. I was only about 6 or 7 because I was determined to write.
That's amazing. That's a great story. So, so what were your early stories about? Did you just
horses and nature? You know, and very much about nature, because I loved writing about animals. I was. It's really funny, actually, because I was having a sort out just recently and came across old school reports. And it's funny, when we were in primary school in Britain, there was literally a subject called nature study. And it totally went over my head. I actually got an A in nature study every single year. So I just loved the natural world. I loved being out, and I could make up stories about animals, and so did my mum. She made up wonderful stories about animals. I've always thought one of these days I'm going to write down her stories because they were terrific. But there was also always horses, you know, and I draw horses, and you know, it's Jackie has a pony. Jackie goes to the gymkhana. Jackie gets a pony for her birthday. You know, that fell on deaf ears.
That's great.
Jackie
and it's still
tries again to get a pony on her birthday.
1 year later, hint, hint. Oh, that's great. Okay, so do you dream about your characters?
Oh, I not deliberately, no, but they definitely come to me. And in fact, that's usually when I know it's time, even where it you know, there's a certain time of year I usually start a new book. I'm researching, but then when I really, you know, my fingers hit those keys, and sometimes I'll really know because it all starts coming into my dreams. Oh, here we go, you know. But I had a very interesting experience once talking. It's not about dreams, but characters and so on. I was having a lot of trouble with my fingers, a lot of pain. And a friend of a friend did massage therapy and all this, and she was a bit of a healer. And I was talking to her, and she said, "Well, give me your hands." And she started massaging my hands, and she said, "Oh, you know what's wrong with your fingers?" And I said, "Well, what is it?" She said, "That you've just got to get to work." She said, "You've got a story in there, and it wants to come out." It's a bit woo woo, but you know, so I just started writing that day, and she was right. The pain went away.
That's amazing. That's a great story. That's too funny. Yeah. You know, the more and more, one of the, you know, blessings of this pandemic, for lack of a better word, is that I have been talking personally with more writers than ever before. I mean, we have people in store and they give their talks, but it's different than the one-on-one conversations. And I have heard more woo-woo stories in this past year, talking with people. It's amazing to me. I mean, you have the complete pragmatists over here who are like, of course I'm in control of everything. I'm the writer, I'm in control. And then you have the people whose characters are fully formed and take the wheel and dreams and all of that. And it's fascinating to me. But I am not surprised at all by your books that that is your approach. That's the side you err on. Okay, so you know what? We have quite a few questions, and some of them repeat some of the questions on my notes. So what I'm going to do is actually let those questions come from audience members. Okay, so Sally, I know you've been sitting here on this question for a while. We're getting to it now. You've suggested in your newsletter that Maisie will take a different path going forward. Would you say more about that?
Did I say that? I think I suggested that for a while ago, actually, and she's on that path in The Consequences of Fear. That is her path. She's it's not exactly a path, so to speak. Everyone was in the war was asked to do their national service, and as we know from the American agent, she's already done a level of national service because she was an ambulance driver, and with Priscilla, and then of course there was the accident, and you can't go back to that once you've had that kind of accident and being involved, because and to this day, often paramedics, I think, if they've been involved in something really bad, they can't go back to it. But anyway, be that as it may. If you remember in The Mapping of Love and Death, there's a letter given to Maisie from Maurice Blanche that he has written for her. And in that letter, he indicates, we know that Maurice was involved in working for the intelligence and clandestine work in France during the First World War. And he says to her, you will be called to serve in the future. I think you will be called to serve in the future. And, and it will be the making of you. But so, in fact, she has been called to serve. But she finds herself at a crossroads with that work. And so that is one of the things that comes out in The Consequences of Fear. But, for someone to that question, for someone like Maisie Dobbs, at this point in her life and with her experience, when you read The Consequences of Fear, you'll realize that she is thinking about what comes next and how is my life going to look and feel, although that's my language, not hers. But how does she shape her world now that she has a daughter that she adores and wants to spend time with? And so she's at a point where, she's thinking, what comes next and how do I work? And she's pretty passionate about her work. She feels that she serves in her work. But how's that going to look in the future? And the next several books will show us more about that.
And we see Anna in this book, and it's nice to see that developing. It's nice. Okay, Sarah was wondering, what were your favorite sources for researching the SOE?
I've been curious about the SOE for donkey's years. I mean, many donkey's years, very British phrase. Probably going back a good 20, 25 years. And it was just a matter of reading and finding. I'm a big one for snooping around, antiquarian bookshops and so on and so forth, and finding old books. But more, there's been an awful lot written in very recent years, but I'd like to go back to memoir and to maybe original accounts and so on and so forth. But a lot of that was classified. I will say that in terms, I first knew about the SOE. I didn't know it was called the SOE. I didn't know the details. But in childhood, I knew that there were women in particular who went to France. And because there was a lady that lived not far from us who lived in what was called a grace and favor house, which means it was a house that was owned by basically the land was owned by the monarchy and the crown, as it was, crown lands, and a lot of the cottages were they could be let out and so on, but there were always cottages that were kept as quote unquote grace and favor houses, which are given by the grace of the monarch for the favor of the work, or some combination of that. And she lived in one of those, and that was her life. She had given so much for the country, and it was sort of one of those things that in a village, common knowledge, but nobody talks about it.
Right, sure, yeah.
But I was a little girl when we passed her, and my mum leaned down and said to me, she was one of those women that parachuted into France during the war. What's a parachute?
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Well, maybe that's a story that can wait till later. That my mum found out from the farmer's wife.
Of course. Just word of
but
mouth.
there is a lot of research. But the fact is that often I don't need to go into the depth of research, depending on the level of engagement that my character has with a role. I do tend to do more research than I ever need, because whilst I might not use it, it informs every word, and it informs an emotion, and so on and so forth. But there's so much written about the SOE these days, and plus, also years ago, I knew that Vera Atkins. I think we all know who Vera Atkins is if we know about the SOE. She lived actually in the next village over from my mum and dad, so. I think possibly in a Grace and Favor house, until she went into, I think she was quite old when she then went into a nursing home on the coast. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, it's all, I mean, they're all incredible stories. I'm glad that there's more about them now, obviously, coming out, because it's just incredible. Okay. Deb was wondering, has the pandemic helped or hindered your writing?
Neither. I work from home. I've worked from a home office. I mean, virtually all my professional life, because previously when I worked for companies, I was invariably what they used to call field-based. So I'm used to working from home. The pandemic didn't change anything much, and just got on with it. Didn't make it better or worse.
So I'm going to ask the question. I don't know if anyone has asked it yet in the comments. There are more comments popping up, but what are you working on now? And will we get another Maisie Dobbs book next year?
You're going to get another Maisie Dobbs book.
Right.
If I told you, it would really spoil things.
That's fine. That's fine. I got the answer I wanted. I'm good.
But let's say, I mean, it's as usual, that it's a many-pronged approach, so to speak. But one of the characters is a first lady of the United States.
Oh,
that's all I'm going to say about that, as far as Trump would say.
Well, speaking of Americans, we've already kind of addressed this a little bit, but will Maisie ever find love and get to revel in it for a while?
Right. Oh, read the book.
All right, there we go.
It would be churlish of me not to give her another crack at love, wouldn't it? And people say, well, she's had all these things happen to her, but during that period of time, people had terrible things happen to them.
Yeah.
I mean, there were women who, in the Great War, they lost they're young women. They would lose their brother, their sweetheart, their cousins, the boys they grew up with, and possibly all on the same day in the same battle, because of the way they structured the regiments, the battalions in those days. I mean, that level of grief, and then possibly to see their son, if they marry later, to see their sons go off to war. Actually, my memoir, I talk about this lady that I knew as a kid, and gosh, she had, I think she lost 2 boys in the Second World War, and then her husband had died. I'm trying to remember, but I think from wounds that he had sustained in the First World War, and because a lot of people go on for a while with awful wounds. My grandmother, I heard the story. One of my aunts says, I'm not too sure about that, but apparently she refused to wear white to her wedding because her brother had died. He died from his wounds in hospital in London. He had been brought back to London, and then you can imagine how she felt, knowing that her own son was going over to France on D-Day. So people, and we are, look what we're living through right now. Yeah. People go through terrible things in life, and not just characters in books, and it's quite the other way around. I mean, look at this week, some of the things that have happened. You only have to look at the news today. Horrible things happen, So, yeah. But Maisie, well deserving of another chance, I think.
I agree. I'm all in. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you know people or have friends who are like your characters?
No, I'm not one of those people that bases my characters on friends or family. Although I do have a very funny story to tell about that. It was after about the third book in the series or something. My oldest, dearest friend, she's always been one of the first people to read my books, and she lives in England. And her two daughters had read the books, and they were at the time in their late teens. They're much older now, and she said that they were in the kitchen or something, and she suddenly was talking to them about something and telling them what they ought to do, and suddenly the oldest went, "Oh, all right, Priscilla." And it's like, oh, right, okay. But, so she's not terribly like Priscilla, I think, although I guess she has been one in my life to sort of, well, you know what you should do, don't you?
How funny.
Yeah,
How funny.
they started calling her Priscilla every time she nagged them about something, or told them to do this or that, or told them, how they should be dressing or something. All right, Priscilla, that's enough.
That's hilarious. Well, speaking of Priscilla, will we ever see Chantal again? Which is another question later. I see that question. So, will we ever see Chantal again, and why does so much tragedy befall Priscilla?
Yeah, I think you probably mean Pascal. Chantal was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Why does so much tragedy preserve? Because that's what happens in life. I can remember and just to give an example of this, my first visit to the battlefields of the Somme. I took, and you're very quickly back from that area into England, into the South Coast area. And my parents lived in the South Coast area. My parents are now passed away, but and I came back from France, and they met me at the station, and then we went from there to get some fish and chips, which is what you do when you want something to eat in England. And we parked right outside the war memorial in this very small town. And I just looked sideways, bearing in mind I've just spent the last 3 days trooping across old battlefields, and all part of my research for a book. And there were the names. And you're 4 boys from one family, 3 boys from another family, 2 boys from another family, and there's a long list from the First World War, and then always a slightly shorter list for the Second World War. Not that fewer people were killed, but remember, it's the way they structured the regiments. By the Second World War, they knew we cannot have all the men from one village going into battle at the same time. We've got to mix people up. But then seeing the same names in the Second World War, you see, so people lost, look at what happened in those years. I mean, you went from the First World War, then there were other conflicts, there was conflicts in the Middle East, there was the Spanish Civil War, and then you move into, the Second World War. And people, talk about keep calm and carry on, I can remember reading this one account. This woman said, and this is going into about 1920, she said, "Oh, for the day when we don't see people in mourning again." That's, everybody's lost someone. And those were in the days when people really respected the wearing of mourning, that you wear black for a year and then you wear lavender or mauve or whatever to show that you're coming out of that. So about Priscilla, yes, she's seen some terrible things. So has Maisie. So have so many people that they come across in the course of their day. And let's think about Billy Beale. Where did we leave his son in The American Agent? He thinks his son has got a jammy posting. He's in Singapore. And in early 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese.
Yeah.
So, it's I'm exploring a period through these characters. So it's not. So they, they're having to endure what people would have endured, but they also have the lightness and the times of lightness, the times of joking, the times of laughter that people had that sustained them, and the companionship as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my all-time favorite characters. What was the inspiration for Maurice, his meditation, and his other methods?
Gosh, he came to me absolutely fully formed, and I knew who he was. I had a sense of his background. I knew that he was this really interesting character that could, he's his mother's Scottish, his father's French. He's been educated in Britain, so and he can slip from one accent to the other, which is something sort of that Maisie can do a bit. If you listen to the audio version, I think she gives him a French accent, but in fact, in my head, he doesn't have that.
That's funny.
But it's what you need to do in an audio to differentiate between characters. And if there's no one person that ever inspired Maurice Blanche, he was just there. I mean, this mentor character, this man who is not without his own background, and we find out a bit more about that in The Consequences of Fear. But possibly because he too has been an only child, as is Maisie, and his background, he's had a lot of opportunities to explore who he is, especially as a young man, because we understand in the early books that he's spent time, with Khan, for example, and you always get the impression that he was having to sort himself out at one point in his life, and he becomes this very very interesting, very accomplished man who's not only been a medical doctor but also a forensic scientist, and a pathologist. So he's got all these skills, but he's something of a philosopher and psychologist, and someone, if anyone was ever going to spot Maisie and to be able to bring out her natural talents, it was going to be Maurice Blanche. So it was that serendipitous moment when they crossed. In his manner, he is something like one of my oldest teachers that I was somewhat close to, but not in, I certainly never knew anyone that was into meditation when I was a kid.
So related, this question just popped up, but since we're talking about Maurice, would he have known sign language?
He might have known sign language. Yeah.
So we have another question here from Christy. Has it been difficult to switch wars?
No, not at all. Because in fact, as many historians will say, that the First World War and the Second World War formed just another European 30 Years' War.
Yeah.
It's, this too has gone before. And if you look at everything that was going on in the middle, it's just almost that war never ended. World War never ended. And in fact, in The Consequences of Fear, one of the things that comes out of the certain wars in the Middle East in the early 1920s, and then, the rise of fascism. Actually, it was in 1917, they were already, that's when they started the initial plans for the evacuation of children in the event of another war. They knew it was going to happen. It was there was the Paris Peace Conference, which left a lot of ends untied or tied not terribly well. I'm just talking about the Middle East. That was a absolute, example, and we're still seeing the outcome of that today, where the Middle East was just divvied up according to political, desires at the time, rather than listening to the woman who knew how it should be done because she had studied the area,
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, and then you think of, there's what became the Second World War, but Hitler was already trying out blitzkrieg in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, look at the bombing of Guernica. That was horrible, and then worked there. So that, let's now try it on Poland, France, the Netherlands, and Britain. So it's not, it's not difficult to switch wars because they're very different wars, but they're the same war in a way. One is an extension of the other, the passing of time. Yeah.
Okay, so one last question. I think this is interesting. How do your British and American fans compare regarding cultural grief from the world wars in particular?
That's an interesting question. I get emails from both. I get messages and so on. I get responses to my books from both. And I would say, well, from Americans, there's always there are people that write to me because they have not learned about, for example, the First World War in school. They were not aware of the devastation that happened in not just London, but British cities like Liverpool, Leeds, Glasgow, Southampton, so on, Portsmouth during the Second World War, and the impact. People hear about the evacuation of children. Well, what does that really mean? What does that really mean? And learning about that. So there is that. I'll just recount a lovely letter I had, and it was after writing Maisie Dobbs. I had a letter from a 94-year-old lady in Britain, which almost broke my heart. And it might have been after Birds of a Feather, but she'd read one or two of my books. And she told me this story that her father took his own life in something like 1921. And because he could not live with the memories of the First World War. And she had been haunted by this her entire life, that she grew up not knowing how he must have felt. And she said, I'm 94 years old. I've read your books and now I know. And she said, now I know. And she said, I feel that I'm coming to a sense of peace. And so I think, yes, in Britain there's that sense of lest we forget, which is actually not only in Britain, you'll find it in Canada and across what was then the Empire, which is the Commonwealth, the sense of lest we forget. And you'll see that every November the 11th, if you're in Britain, 11 o'clock, people will stop what they're doing and they will, there'll be the 2-minute silence as a respect. So there is that knowledge already there, but people also like to tell me their stories and about, it's encouraged them to find out about their grandfather or their great grandfather or something like that. And then of course there's just the people who suddenly have renewed respect for their grandmothers and their great grandmothers, and particularly amongst young women, and that counts for both sides of the Atlantic. And a lot of people I know really loved The American Agent. There are some people that even as older people that read my books that have a memory of being children and listening to some of the broadcasts from London and so on, and younger ones. And I don't want to go on, but just the other day I had a lovely message from someone in this country about her grandmother who was a war bride on the Second World War and came to this country, and it was a lovely. So I get lovely emails from people telling me about their family history. So
that must be the biggest compliment and the most rewarding part about this. That must be wonderful.
It is that people and also that people then decide to dig deep and they've heard about this, but it never meant anything to them about someone's engagement in a war, and then suddenly, I heard Granddad was at Verdun. I wonder what happened to him there. Boom, and suddenly they're in there, and it's come alive for them. That this person that they maybe knew, or the great grandfather that they've only heard about, suddenly comes alive for them because they've been able to dig in and find out, and then because that takes them to some non-fiction books,
Right.
And that's the thing about fiction, is that you can touch truth and you touch universal truths, and that can take people to the facts of their own lives, which I think is one of the feels like a good day's work sometimes.
Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap up than that. That's a perfect end to this conversation. Jackie, as always, I just absolutely adore talking with you. I could talk with you for hours on end, but tonight we're going to go ahead and wrap this up for our audience. Thank you to those of you watching. We've had a great crowd. I appreciate
Thank you.
questions. And as I've said multiple times, we have signed copies of Consequences of Fear available, and I highly recommend it, as I do with any of Jackie's books. So thank you all for watching, and everyone have a good night. Good night, Jackie.
Good night, and thank you very much, everyone. You had some great questions, and I really appreciate you coming and joining us. Lovely to see you, McKenna. Maybe
Lovely
next time.
Hopefully in person. Absolutely. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.